So this is a video I've been wanting to do for quite some time. We're going to look at a comparison of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and Philip II, King of Spain. Now I know Spain at this time was Castile, Aragon, Granada, and a couple other kingdoms, but I think when I say Spain, people know what I mean, the Iberian Peninsula. Both of them had numerous other titles, but that would take too long to go into, and I think you know what I mean. Now, there's a lot of reasons to compare these two men, aside from just the fact that it's father son, and inevitably people are going to compare a father to his son. Both of them saw themselves as the secular or temporal leader of Christendom. Both of them saw themselves as being the universal monarch, the ruler of all Europe, at least symbolically. There was a very strong messianic quality to both men, which they themselves believed in, but also was very common among their followers. Both of them commanded an empire on both the North American and European, and to a certain extent the African continent, on which the sun never set. Now, it's a bit debatable, in my opinion, what the first global empire was. I think the Mongols have a decent claim to that, but you can definitely say that the Spanish Habsburg, whatever you want to call it, empire under Charles V and Philip II certainly counted. It's not shown on this map, but they also had some holdings within East Asia that would eventually become the Philippines. Both men spent most of their lives fighting wars, although Charles was in the saddle a lot more than his son was. Both of them ruled over a patchwork of European territories, almost none of which were contiguous and that were a constant headache and difficult to manage. Now, there are a lot of differences between the two men. Charles V had a certain charisma to him, both in terms of personality and the messianic aura that surrounded him was far greater than even his son's. There was a very real hope with Charles V that he would restore Rome, he would restore Charlemagne's empire, and he would end the disputes and the divisions within Christendom. In contrast, Philip was much more conservative in terms of dress, uh, habits. He lived a much more healthy. I don't know. Puritan's not really the way, but he lived a much cleaner, more regimented life. While Charles V was certainly a hard worker, Philip II was an obsessive worker who would work like 14, 16 hours a day just doing paperwork. I think ultimately what it comes down to is Charles V was Burgundian through and through. Despite spending a lot of his time in Spain and Italy, I think he never really got too far away from his Burgundian heritage, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Whereas Philip was very much a Spanish monarch. Spain very much being known for how conservative and formal and regimented court rituals were. So, for part one of this, we're just going to go into what was the situation the two men inherited. Because if you're going to judge a leader, you have to see what it is that they came into. The main reason, for instance, that Aurelian is such a great Roman Empire is he inherited an empire that had been chopped into thirds and had basically independent parts in the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyran Empire in the east, and he was able to very rapidly reunite all the lands and deal with the divisions. So let's take a look at this. Now, the first thing to keep in mind whenever we're talking about this period in European history is the population distribution was very, very different. Now, nowadays, France and Britain, I think, have basically the same population. It's only a couple million off. It's kind of negligible. But that was not the case back in the day. So Charles V was around the 15th century. France had a population, I'm just going to round, of 16 million versus 4 million in Britain. So, or rather, sorry, 4 million in England and Wales. Also, if you look at the population of the German Empire, so they're using the borders of the 1914 German Empire. So that's roughly the Kingdom of Germany within the Holy Roman Empire. Sorry if some of the terminology in terms of place names and locations gets kind of confusing, but it was even confusing at the time, let alone at present. And I guess just kind of a disclaimer this late in the video. While I do have a lot of notes for this, my notes are mainly covering the core points, so there might be some like minor details that I get wrong. But yeah, my point is at the time France was larger than all of the German Empire and England and Wales combined. France was also, to my understanding, more centralized than a lot of states in Europe. France used to be known as being an extremely decentralized country in which the king controlled, I think it was just basically Paris and Orleans. But after the Hundred Years' War, the king controlled a lot of the country directly. France was also more culturally unified than a lot of the other countries, or I suppose you could say politically unified. You just don't really have, in the case of France, with the exception of maybe Burgundy and some of the stuff during the French Wars of Religion that you have in the Holy Roman Empire, where when countries would invade, some of the local princes would side with the invading country and provide it with a base or provide it with military support. That just didn't really happen with France. So France was the dominant power. It was much stronger than any one rival power, and it would more or less take a coalition in order to bring it down. And much of Charles's reign would be uh, founding successive coalitions to keep France in check, something he was very successful at. So I just think that's important to keep in mind because when you look at the land that the Habsburgs controlled at the time, because they controlled Spain, the southern half of Italy, Milan, all this territory. A, they didn't directly control most of the Holy Roman Empire. And B, this is nowhere near as populated as relative to France as it would be later on. Now, this was an area where Philip was a lot more lucky than his father was. France, during most of Philip's reign, was engulfed in the wars of religion, where the Protestant Huguenots, who I believe were mostly Calvinist, were in a civil war against the Catholic monarchy. And Philip would support the French monarchy, the Catholic side throughout it, but he didn't really have to worry about France trying to seize all of Italy or push their borders to the west bank of the Rhine or take the Low Countries in nearly the same way that Charles was. Interestingly, the books I read don't really talk about it that much, but I think if Philip had been inclined, he, in alliance with the Austrian Habsburgs, might have been able to just really devastate and possibly partition France and leave it kind of a husk of its former self. I think it speaks to Philip's character that he opted not to do that because he saw that as being taking advantage of a religious conflict when his job was not to use it for secular or cynical political purposes, but to take the opportunity as the leader of Catholicism, as the leader of Christendom, to try to restore proper Christianity to France. In terms of the size of the inheritance, this is also something that's a little bit difficult to kind of get a grasp on. So theoretically, Charles V inherited all this territory here. But almost immediately, he offloaded the Austrian lands of the Habsburgs to his brother Ferdinand I. And even though he was technically Holy Roman Emperor, for a great deal of his reign, Ferdinand I more or less acted in his stead as kind of the de facto Holy Roman Emperor. And these territories were inherited by Ferdinand I, and they weren't under his purview. So he was sometimes able to take territory, or sorry, to take money and soldiers from Germany, but he didn't really directly control this. The land he mostly directly controlled was Spain, southern Italy, and the Netherlands. So I guess you could say, functionally speaking, the land he directly controlled and the land his son inherited were roughly the same size. While both kings had to deal with the Ottoman Empire, because Philip II was not the king, the Holy Roman Emperor, he didn't really have to bother too much with the land invasions. So he wasn't super involved the way his father had been in trying to deal with the Ottoman forces in Hungary or Bohemia or wherever in eastern Germany. He still had to deal with the Ottomans primarily within the Mediterranean, but he didn't have to deal with the large land campaigns that his father did. Philip II also inherited a much enlarged Spanish empire overseas. Cortez and Pizarro both happened during Charles V's reign, and indeed most of Philip II's ventures, many of which failed, were financed with money he got from the Americas. Charles V also got money from the Americas, but Philip II had a lot more territory that he could levy taxes on. So I'd say at like an outset, the position that they inherited was relatively similar. Philip arguably had less in the way of resources, and the Austrian Habsburgs weren't directly subject to him. But at the same time, he didn't have to deal with as many powerful enemies as his father had. On that subject, another big difference, if we're talking about background, is Charles V was a Burgundian through and through, and that would stay with him for most of his life. And that was, generally speaking, a pretty big advantage. As Burgundy being this weird mixture of Dutch, French, and a bit of German, wasn't really regarded as being foreign to the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The Netherlands also saw him as their guy. Like some people might have thought it was weird that they were ruled by this guy who mainly lived in Spain, but because he had grown up in the Netherlands, they were personally loyal to him. So having being from kind of the center of Europe, I think was pretty helpful to him, as the Dutch and the Germans didn't really view him as being a foreigner in the same way they would view Philip, who was thoroughly Spanish culturally by the time he inherited. The Burgundians were a very boisterous people. A lot of, from my understanding, the stereotypes about chivalry, feats of arms, courtly love, epic poems, and all that kind of stuff is very much a part of Burgundian culture. And once again, that outlook served Charles pretty well. In particular, when he challenged the King of France to fight him IRL. In contrast, like I said, Philip was seen as a foreigner within the Netherlands, and although the Spanish tended to see him more of as a native Spaniard, so he probably in some ways had more support there, and he had spent most of his life governing Spain, which was the wealthiest of the Spanish Habsburg territories. He was far less popular in the Netherlands than his father had been. And maybe just briefly also talk about the religious issues. So Spain had a little bit of Protestantism creeping into it. Philip imposed pretty strict censorship and banned a lot of translations of books from other countries into Spanish. He actually was a big patron of the arts and sciences, setting up universities, and like I said, funding science and that sort of thing. But Spain became somewhat isolated culturally and in terms of just ideas under his reign. But Spain stayed entirely Catholic, and even to this day, you don't really have many Protestants in Spain. Charles V came to power before the Reformation, but he had to deal with the Schmalkaldic League and a large civil war within the Holy Roman Empire caused by that. The only real territory that Philip controlled that where Protestantism was a big issue was the Netherlands, and being a very conservative Catholic who wanted to continue to enforce heresy laws, including execution, further alienated him from the population there. When you're dealing with people from this time period, it's important to keep in mind that regardless of what movies tell you, the religious belief was not superficial and it was not cynical. Philip would many times make decisions based on what his conscience told him and what he thought was religiously appropriate rather than what was necessarily expedient. An issue both of them had, but Philip was much worse at this, was the idea that because they were fighting for the Holy Mother Church, God would grant them miracles, and they would sometimes cut corners or not really plan things or not have a backup plan because they were so convinced that divine favor would follow them. Now, Charles V was known for, and I can't think of too many examples off the top of my head, but he was known for being extremely lucky, whereas Philip was extremely unlucky, generally speaking. Sorry, slight side note on the religious issue, just because it's interesting. There was a lot of goodwill initially towards Martin Luther. Even Charles V felt that a lot of his ideas in terms of administrative and church reform were good. There was a lot of sympathy towards him, even from very devout Catholics in the Netherlands and in Germany. I think to a lesser extent in Spain, just because it was further away. And a lot of the ideas people were really on board with. It was when he started theologically attacking the core dogmas of the Catholic Church that a lot of people, such as Charles V, turned on him. Because a lot of people were unhappy with the popes. Something you see during both this period and the 30 Years' War is the papacy is generally pro France, but you have Holy Roman emperors and Spanish kings who are the strongest defenders of the papacy. So it leads to this really weird situation. Part of that's because the papal states are sandwiched between Habsburg possessions in both the north and the south. So let's talk now about their reigns, the successes, the failures, and how we can kind of characterize it. Now, I would characterize Charles's reign as being mostly successful. He mostly succeeded at his ventures. The problem was he wasn't really able to finish anything. And unlike his son, this wasn't because he tended to procrastinate and not make decisions. And if you've ever seen the movie Up, there's the dog who starts talking and then he goes squirrel and looks the other direction. And Philip was a lot more like that. Charles V just spent most of his life in the saddle, going from place to place, trying to put out fires. And it was very difficult because he probably could have resolved the religious division in Germany. He beat the Schmalkaldic League, and he probably could have brought about religious uniformity. The issue was every time he tried to do that, the Ottomans would invade, and the Lutheran princes would demand a period of religious toleration in exchange for funding and troops. And this more or less kept happening as every time he was about to resolve the religious question in Germany, France would invade, or the Ottomans would invade, or something else would happen, and he was never able to really deal a knockout blow. The other issue is the Pope didn't want to call a general council, although Charles V was begging him to do it. Charles V felt it was long overdue to call an ecumenical council to clarify a lot of aspects of dogma and to just reform the church and deal with all the grievances and the issues. And he felt if they could have just addressed that, then Protestantism would have lost most of the wind in its sails and it would have been defeated. So I don't think the emergence of Protestantism and it becoming entrenched as a denomination is necessarily inevitable. It's just that Charles was never able to decisively knock it out for very good reasons. Eventually, they did finally get the Ecumenical Council, which was the Council of Trent. Part of why the Pope didn't want to call one was because France didn't want him to call one, as the fear was the council would just be completely dominated by Germans and the Holy Roman Empire, which it was, and most of the decisions it made were in line with what the Germans wanted. But like I said, whenever he was about to finish something like defeat Protestantism, dismember France, retake Hungary and a bunch of territory in Eastern Europe, kick the Ottomans out of the Western Mediterranean, something else would pop up and he wasn't able to put his back into it, so to speak, and to just finally resolve one of the many issues he was facing. But I think, unlike his son, that wasn't really because he didn't want to, it was just kind of the reality of the situation. I also think he was a lot better at delegating than his son was. He very early on put Ferdinand in charge of Germany, And Ferdinand, by and large, did a good job, and he didn't really have to worry about the minutiae of it. I believe it was his sister who was regent in the Netherlands, and she also did a good job. And he put Philip in charge of Spain. So he was more or less free to a certain extent to focus on the big picture of the empire. And he had competent people running the various portions of it. Philip was, from what I've read, not as good as delegating and was very much a micromanager who wanted to decide everything himself. He didn't want to trust his subordinates with anything. He was very indecisive. I mean, the issue is if you're going to be like you want to centralize all the decision making power in your hands and personally do things, you can't procrastinate. You can't not focus on things. And you can't micromanage at the same, and you can't like not, you know what I mean? Especially if you're controlling territories that are very far apart from each other. Now, the Habsburgs did have a very efficient postal system by the standards of the time, but they still had a postal system, and it was kind of a mess to get to the various territories. I mean, France is kind of smack dab in the middle of a lot of them. Maybe to just talk a bit more about accomplishments. Arguably, the greatest accomplishment of Charles V was winning the Italian Wars decisively in the favor of the Holy Roman Empire. See, around this time period, France had overrun a lot of northern Italy. Milan had been militarily occupied and was going to be forced into a personal union. France was just steamrolling through northern Italy like a bulldozer through a brick wall. And Charles was able to rally his forces together and kick France out completely to the point where Milan became a Habsburg possession. And it was completely denied to France. Now, what was kind of interesting about this is during the Battle of Pavia, the French army got completely annihilated. And not only that, but they managed to capture the King of France, Francis I. Now, Charles V, I think, showed here one of his weaknesses, which was how chivalrous he was and how he had the dream, like a Burgundian streak to him. And he really wanted to recover Burgundy. So he basically made Francis I sign this treaty that was completely insane. It gave up huge amounts of territory, including Burgundy. It was large amounts of money, concessions in all over the place. There was no way this treaty was ever going to be fulfilled. The French, being the French, accepted it. Francis immediately reneged on it, saying that, it was signed under duress. This is when we get the I'll fight you IRL thing, where Charles kept talking about how he wanted to fight Francis in open combat. Charles was actually a very skilled combatant. He had very good aim with crossbows and his arquebus. He also competed in a number of tournaments and did very well in them, in spite of his truly horrific health problems, which we'll get to later. But I think what can be said of Charles V's reign as a whole is, to a certain extent, what also can be said of Ferdinand II and Ferdinand III during the 30 Years' War. And that's that they survived. They survived with what they inherited intact. They picked up a number of other territories. Charles picked up a bit more of the modern day Netherlands, largely because of Ferdinand I. The Austrian Habsburgs picked up Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, Silesia, and Croatia, which dramatically improved the position of the Habsburgs in Austria and gave them a much larger independent power base. Spain was fully unified, and there wasn't really a threat that it would break up again. And the Netherlands were at least theoretically pacified. So he was able to pass off to his heir an inheritance that was largely intact. Probably one of the more interesting aspects of Charles V is he chose to retire near the end of his life and let his son take over as King of Spain, the Netherlands, and southern Italy, and his brother succeed him as Holy Roman Emperor. Which was probably a good idea, because this is a very complicated series of successions. So it was probably good that he could use his unique prestige to kind of smooth things over. In the meantime, and he turned a monastery into a palace more or less, and he spent his last days there, dying unfortunately of malaria. At least that's from my understanding what the modern theory was. His son lived a lot longer and was a lot healthier than him. I think part of that is probably he didn't spend as much time in the saddle and he ate a much better diet. You see, Charles V, because of his Habsburg jaw, couldn't really chew food very well. So he would often swallow it whole. And he didn't really eat anything other than meat, at least in his later years. So you have a diet that largely consisted of meat that he swallowed whole. So it gave him extreme indigestion and hemorrhoids. All of his teeth had fallen out. He had horrendous gout. I think it got to the point where most of the ligaments in his body had dissolved. He had a sauna that he spent a lot of his days in. He was in really miserable shape, whereas Philip was in very good condition until the very end of his life, which is why he lived so much longer. Now, if we go back to Philip, it's largely a mixed bag. I don't think he technically lost much in terms of territory. He more or less lost control over most of the Netherlands. And I read the book. I don't entirely understand what the compromise was. The 80 Years' War is we're not even going to really get into it. But at the very least, he had to cede an immense amount of local power to the Netherlands in terms of the local provinces and cities. The constant warfare there completely bankrupted Spain and really didn't lead to much in the way of a positive result. Now, Charles V also bankrupted Spain. It was kind of funny because his creditors came to Philip II. They're like, you got to pay your father's debts back. And Philip just basically told them to F off. And he didn't pay them. Although the whole thing got really confusing, the finances of the time were just really messed up. And everyone was in constant debt. And defaults and renegotiations and all that stuff were extremely common. Philip, however, was especially bad at it. So when we look at Philip's career, there's a lot of times where he could have been really successful, but he dithered. Probably a good example of that is what happened with England. So he married Mary Tudor, which was never going to work out, just because she was too old really to have children at the time. But because he married her, he provided her with a whole bunch of support. And England actually went back to being a Catholic country under her. And not just in terms of the state religion, but they brought in I think the Jesuits, they brought in a lot of priests and stuff, and they were reconverting a lot of the country. They had swapped a lot of the educational institutions back over. And really, if the process had been allowed to continue for another decade or two, England probably would have been recovered for the Catholic Church. Anglicanism is, to a certain extent, I'd say, a historical accident. Because Henry VIII, I don't think ever really intended to form a Protestant church, and I'd argue Henry VIII wasn't ever really Protestant. He just wanted certain additional powers, plus there was his personal beef with the Pope. I think the expectation was that once he died, things would just reconcile and go back to the status quo. But his son was controlled by radical Protestants, and the whole situation just kind of went into a disaster. But the issue that happened with Mary is when it became clear that Mary would not be having children and she was in poor health and that Philip would outlive her, he had the opportunity to go and negotiate with Elizabeth. He could have recognized her as Mary's heir, offered her his support and his friendship in exchange for continuing either keeping England as officially Catholic or at least ensuring tolerance for English Catholics. But he really dithered about this, and by the time he kind of made up his mind, Mary was dead, Elizabeth had taken the throne, and the whole situation had just really slipped through his fingers. So that left him with a hostile England. I mean, if you look at the map or you know anything about geography, if you're governing the Netherlands from Spain, you kind of don't want England to be hostile to you. And that was kind of an ongoing issue, whereas in the English would fund the Dutch rebels, Drake would also raid Spanish colonies and transports coming from the New World. While I am of an English background myself, I will admit that the Spanish were mostly justified in trying to invade England because England was basically waging a undeclared war against them through extensive piracy. I think Drake was raiding, I forget if it was towns on the Spanish mainland, but definitely the islands around Spain. And they were funding and providing soldiers to the Dutch, which was a constant headache. And this kind of once again brings us to where Philip was really indecisive. So he just came to the decision he was going to do the Spanish Armada. Now, once again, you can go like read about this. Basically, they kept changing their minds about it. He dithered a lot on this one. So, like, an issue they ran into was a lot of the ships were rotting in port while they were waiting for them to go. If you look at the actual numbers, I think the Spanish actually were outnumbered by the English and Dutch. The Spanish probably had more warships, but it wasn't as if the fleet was nearly as big as people think it was in comparison. Another one of the issues was the whole thing was just really poorly planned and thought out. The commander he put in charge of it, or rather, the final person he put in charge of it was competent, but he more or less was like, Philip, you got to give me control over this. You got to give me control. You got to give me this stuff. This thing's just not going to work. And eventually, Philip just got pissed off. He's like, just invade England. Just go do it. And they're like, okay, we need a backup plan. If we're not able to land at the targeted spot, should we maybe go to Scotland and bolster them? Maybe we could turn around and go to Ireland and set up a bridgehead there and then bring our soldiers over there. And Philip's like, no, we can't have a backup plan. God will provide. God will provide us a proper wind. He'll grant us victory. We don't need a backup plan. Another major issue was coordination between the fleet and the land forces in Holland was almost impossible. It really wasn't planned out very well, and it landed in a disaster, which bankrupted Spain. And then they went and they tried to do it again with the same result, and it was equally a mess. And it was just kind of a capstone. I think that really symbolized a lot of Philip's reign. Once again, when you're coming down to stuff like the Dutch Revolt, he dithered a lot on that. One option would have been to just completely crush them. And they kind of did that, but didn't go far enough with it. The other option would have been to grant some concessions. And Philip really dithered on making up his mind about it. So the Dutch Revolt got worse and worse, and it just became a series of uh, bloody reprisals on both sides. And it just became a slugfest that devastated the Netherlands, which had previously been very wealthy. So the whole area just became a massive drain on Castile's treasury, and it took away funding from a lot of other projects. Because keep in mind, all of Castile's money, like Philip would have to mortgage the revenues for like a decade in advance to pay for this stuff, and most of it just kind of went on like these nothing burger projects. Like the Armada was 100% wasted money. Most of the 80 Years' War was wasted money. If he had have granted relatively limited privileges at the start of it, he probably could have held on to the Netherlands and resolved the issue. But the whole thing was kind of like one massive half measure. I remember at the end of the book, one of his courtiers says, if we had have just picked something and focused on it, we might have had success in that area. And we probably could have. We didn't face the same issues that Charles did to nearly the same extent. Like either just focus on the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, or focus on pacifying Holland, or focus on the enterprise of England. Just pick one of them and resolve it. And this is kind of unrelated to a certain extent, but it's just such a cool piece of history. I have to talk about it. So if you've ever seen Game of Thrones, in Dorne, bastards are treated very differently. They have a much higher status and they normally receive part of the inheritance. That's actually based on history because bastards are treated a lot better in Spain. One of Charles V's bastards married the Duke of Florence, and a lot of his daughters he granted inheritances to. So his bastard son Don John of Austria was kept a secret until Charles died, and when Philip found out about him, he like welcomed him into his home. He was given the title of Austria, so he was a Habsburg. He marched in precedence. He was behind the royal family, but above the great lords. And Don John of Austria was called by G.K. Chesterton the last knight of Europe. And he was known for being the commander at a little battle called Lepanto, where they completely destroyed the Turkish fleet. And he also had some successes in the Netherlands and pacifying it. The goal, which unfortunately didn't happen, was he was going to invade England and marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and that would have England would have had the hero of Lepanto as its king. So I'm kind of sad that never happened, but yeah, Don John was a badass. A lot of respect for him, and good on Philip for making use of him and recognizing his talents. Once again, infidelity on part of a male monarch was not really considered to be out of the ordinary. As a friend of mine said, if you're a king, all the thoughts in the country are throwing themselves at you, and it's very hard to resist. I mean, there's some people like William the Conqueror who did, but yeah. So that was a success. They won a lot in the Mediterranean. Probably the most notable success of Philip was most of the Portuguese royal family died in a failed excursion to uh, North Africa, and that left Philip as being the legitimate heir, or one of the legitimate heirs to the Portuguese throne. So he acted quickly and was able to seize Portugal. And then we had the Iberian Union, I think, for 70 years or so, where Portugal was in personal union with Spain. So almost all of the overseas colonies in the world were in the hands of one monarch. So, I mean, that worked out pretty well. Also, his support, I think, was fairly critical in Catholicism winning out in France. So, from that standpoint, he did help out the faith quite a bit. But I think at the end of the day, Philip left behind a Spain that was massively in debt, far weaker than it had been previously. Well, it had technically survived the ravages of the last couple decades. It was not exactly a shadow of its former self, but it had issues like hyperinflation. They had burned through an immense amount of gold without spending almost any of it on economic development. Castile had been more or less bled dry. The Netherlands were something that the Habsburgs were never able to figure out. The hope of Charles V and early on Philip II was that they could marry into the English royal family and they could pass off the either to a Habsburg or to a I guess it was a Tudor heir at the time, Holland, and then you would have the Habsburg Kingdom of England and Holland, or which makes sense as a one contingent unit because they're so close to each other, and that would get rid of it. But the problem is the Netherlands was very much a white elephant. Getting rid of it would have resulted in a massive loss of prestige. It was also extremely wealthy, at least in Charles's day. There had been a really bad economic depression, uh, which was one of the causes of the 80 Years' War. So while not generating money anymore, it didn't even pay for itself, and like I said, required massive subsidies from Castile to just keep the lights on. As I said though, like once again, Philip was a foreigner. He didn't go. He only went to the Netherlands, I think, once during his time as king. Charles was their guy. Charles was the man. He was Burgundian. They were loyal to him personally. Philip was this Spanish weirdo who didn't speak their language, who didn't share their values. who was this very cold and kind of impersonal person, unlike Charles, who was a lot more charismatic. Now, to Philip's credit, he was an extremely hard worker. He had a very centralized bureaucracy. He spent pretty much all day, every day, just doing paperwork, reading various reports, writing yes or no on them, meeting with his councils on a constant basis. The problem was a lot of the stuff was not really like important. There was one case, I'm trying to think of how to describe it, where an abbot wrote him and he's like, I'm having trouble divvying up the cells among the various friars. And Philip was like, that's really cool. So he got like a chart out and he got like the number of years of experience and the individual accomplishments of the friars. And he came up with like this big plan. It's kind of like playing with a trade set. And that wasted a huge amount of time. And he just spent a lot of time like on stuff like that, or planning out details of buildings. He just was very much like distracted by that. And I mean, Charles had his hobbies too. Charles loved hunting. He went hunting constantly. Although in his case, hunting served a very important political purpose. Most of his major decisions were taken when he came back from hunting. It was also a very good way to really sit down and have a in-depth private conversation with whoever he went hunting with. But like I said, the issue under Philip is you have someone who massively centralized the government, didn't like to delegate authority, but was indecisive and micromanaged stuff that he shouldn't have been involved in. And so the papers just kept piling up and piling up. Maybe just another kind of funny side note. One of the reasons why the Habsburgs inherited so much territory is because they kept marrying their first cousins. It constantly happened. Uh, Philip's first son had like severe disability. He was like really messed up. He wound up dying very young. But they calculated that the inbreeding coefficient, he was inbred to the same extent as the child of a brother and sister marrying, or brother and sister having a child would. And then you have like the Habsburg jaw for that kind of thing. But that's more or less why they kept inheriting territory, because they kept marrying people from the sub branches to each other. So what can we really say about Charles V and Philip II as a whole? Charles V was a very inspiring and charismatic figure. I think he's very romantic in the sense that had he been more successful, and I don't necessarily think it was any fault of his, maybe he could have successfully concluded a marriage alliance with England and created the Habsburg kingdom there and united Europe, with the exception of France under Habsburg rule. Maybe he could have defeated Protestantism and restored the unity of the church. Maybe he could have even partitioned France and resolved that issue once and for all, or decisively beaten the Ottomans. Despite all that, and despite a lifetime of troubles, he left the Habsburgs in a much, much better position than when he had inherited it. The Habsburgs became a lot more powerful, relatively speaking, in the Holy Roman Empire, as Bohemia, Hungary, Moravia, Silesia were all personal fiefdoms of the king of the Habsburgs that they could draw resources from. He succeeded in holding on to the disparate territories, and he repeatedly beat France. Any particular loss to France, like if he had have lost a major war to France, you might have seen France just overrunning a large portions of Italy or the Netherlands. I think it came pretty close a couple of times, but I think even if he didn't achieve the goal of recreating the Roman Empire, which probably wasn't realistic, he did leave the Habsburgs in a much, much better position than when he inherited it. Once again, with Philip, keeping in mind that he had fewer resources to work with, I don't really think there was that much he accomplished, realistically speaking. He more or less lost the Netherlands for all intents and purposes. He did pick up Portugal, but I don't know if that was ever really going to last very long. And he blew through most of Spain's wealth on enterprises that really didn't go anywhere. And while his father also did that, Charles V had a lot more to show for it. I think part of it is also just Philip II is a much less likable person. He didn't possess the personal charisma his father did. And I think in a lot of cases, Charles V could just kind of bluff his way through things, or he could rely on the mystique that came with him being the universal heir, the last hope of the Habsburgs, the House of Burgundy Valois, and the Trastamaras, the last hope of all these huge, prestigious dynasties that gave him a kind of star power that couldn't really be matched. And the fact that he came from Burgundy, pretty much exactly in the middle of Europe at the time period, meant that he was kind of considered Dutch, but also kind of German, but also kind of French, and was kind of acceptable to most parties. He also was at a time when Protestantism really hadn't fully taken hold, and it wasn't certain whether it was going to be a permanent thing. To his credit, I mean, it's not like Philip led to the destruction of the Spanish Empire. Things certainly could have gone a lot worse. Spain could have lost a lot more territory. The economic situation could be even worse than it wound up being. But I think you can say that Charles's reign was a decisive success, maybe not like an overwhelming success. Like if you're saying success on a scale of 1 to 3, he probably did or I guess -3 to +3, he probably did a 2. He had a good success, but not as much as possible. I'd probably put Philip at like a 0. He didn't technically lose much, but his grand plans more or less all failed. And Spain was left vastly depleted in terms of manpower and resources by the end of his reign. So hopefully that wasn't too rambly. I think I got through all the points that I wanted to discuss. I don't really see anything else in my notes at the moment. So I hope you enjoyed it. These videos take a really long amount of time. I had to read 2 full books to do this, but once again, I hope you enjoy it. Hope you learned something. God bless. Talk to you real soon.